Hello, this is Timo Buske, I work for KDAB and I want to show you how easy it is to create a fully interactive 3D app with Kuesa. Kuesa is a new software solution created by KDAB. It provides a unified workflow for designers and developers to create, optimize and integrate real-time 3D content into 3D or hybrid 2D, 3D software user interfaces. It aims to reduce compromises in design, quality, developer control, performance and productivity. Okay, so this is more or less what you get when you create a new cute quick application from scratch. When I fire this up, I will get an empty window and we are going to fill this now with content. So we have our main CPP, which is basically just loading our main QML file. This is empty for now. And I created another QML file which is called scene QML. This is where we put all the 3D stuff in. First of all, let's start with the main QML. I'm going to create a scene 3D element. Note that I can mix Q3D elements and Kuesa elements as I want, because Kuesa is fully integrated in Q3D. I'm going to set the size to its parent size, and I'm just doing some usual Q3D stuff here. And I'm going to load our scene QML file. Give it the ID scene. So let's switch over. When you have installed Kuesa correctly, you can import it in your QML file and you can create a Kuesa scene entity. Going to give this the ID scene. And next thing we want to do, we want to load the 3D assets into the scene entity. And to load a GLTF file, we use the Kuesa GLTF2 importer. But first of all, we need to add our assets to a resource file. So I'm going to add some existing files here. First of all, our GLTF file, which is the scene file. This comes on export with a binary file where all the mesh data and animation data is stored in. And I also want to add some environment maps for lightning, reflection, skybox and so on. So I'm going to add these to the assets QRC file, and I'm going to load the GLTF file now with the GLTF2 importer. So I'm going to pass a reference to the scene entity, which is called scene. And I'm going to specify the source where the GLTF data is coming from. This is our GLTF file. We don't need to specify the binary file because the GLTF file is referencing the binary file automatically. So let me specify some components for the scene entity. First of all, I want to specify the render settings. Frame graph. I'm using, for this simple example, the forward renderer from Kuesa here. But of course, if you want to implement some advanced technique like deferred lighting and so on, you can do this. But for this simple example, the Kuesa forward renderer, which works out of the box, should be sufficient. Forward renderer. I want to use the camera that comes from the GLTF file itself. So I'm going to specify the camera here. For now, I give this the name camera. We will fetch this later from the GLTF file, some lines below. And I need to enable back to front sorting because we are using transparent materials here, like windshields and so on. So I want to specify the environment light, which defines the lighting and the reflections. So I'm going to create an environment light here. First of all, I define the irradiance. I'm using the texture loader for this. The source is one of our cube maps here. I'm going to load this here. And I want to specify the wrap mode to avoid those ugly edges that can occur on some cube maps. So wrap mode, X, wrap mode, clamp to edge, and same for Y. Actually, it's exactly the same for the specular part, except the name of the file. Specular, and this is called specular. Okay, so now we have defined the environment light. To make this complete, I want to specify the skybox. I can use Kuesa skybox for this. Similar to the environment light, I just need to specify the file where the cube map is stored. So base name is our skybox here. I need to specify the extension. And for the camera, we need to fetch it from the GLTF file. So let's use the asset pipeline editor of Kuesa to find out the name of the camera. I'm going to run this. I'm opening our GLTF file. And on the left hand side, we now have some kind of outliner for the scene here that lists us all the objects which are inside in the scene here. So our cam obviously is called, our camera is obviously called cam. So we can fetch it now with Kuesa.asset. We need to give it a ID. I did this already up here. So it's called camera. We need to pass the scene entity, which is called scene. And we specify the node name as the designer is given in 3ds Max and which is exported to GLTF, and we could see in the asset pipeline editor, which is cam. And we need to specify a collection where this node is coming from, because it could be the case that give another node which is not a camera the same name as this. So our collection would be scene.cameras. Okay, let's check. There's a typo. This one as well. Okay, let's build and see what we get here. Yeah, perfect. Looks exactly like in 3ds Max and in the asset pipeline editor. So let's add some interactivity to our app now. I want to create some sliders to modify the car paint material, the color of the car paint material, and to open the doors. So I will create a little user interface for this and see how easy it is, as usual for Qt3D, to mix 3D content with 2D user interface. So I'm just creating some sliders here. So the first slider is for the color lightness. So I'm going to give this the ID light slider. The value should be, the initial value should be 0. Same for the next one. I call this color slider, which will change the hue of the car paint color. And then I will create a third one, which is called doors slider, which will open and close the doors. The initial value is 0.5. We will see later why this is the case. So now we need to pass the values of the sliders to the scene. So we need to create some properties for this. Property double color lightness, and property double color hue, and property double doors open. I set this to 0. This doesn't matter because it gets overwritten anyways. So let's just pass the values from the slider through to the properties. Color lightness is light slider value, color hue, color slider value, and doors open is door slider value. Okay, that should be it. We now have the values available in our scene QML, and we can now bind this. Let's start with the first two parameters, bind those to the color of the car paint material. So as before, we are going to fetch another node here. As we did for the camera, we just go now for the material, Kuesa asset. The ID should be car paint material. The scene entity is again our scene. And the name of the car paint material we can get again with the asset pipeline editor. Opening up the car GLTF file, browsing for the materials, and there we have our matte car paint material. So now we have the name, we can specify it here. Matte underscore car paint. And again we need to specify the collection where our material is coming from. Scene.materials. So now let's bind the color lightness and the color hue to the base color factor of the material. So I'm creating a binding for this. The target is our car paint material, the node of it. The property is called base color factor, and the value is a color. I'm going to use a simple cube function for this, HSLA, which stands for hue, saturation, lightness, and alpha. So I'm specifying those four components. The hue is obviously the color hue, the slider. The saturation should always be 1. The lightness is the value of our first property, color lightness, scene.color lightness, I don't want to have a white color here, so I'm tinting this down a bit by, let's say, 0.2 or something, and the alpha should always be 1. Okay, let's build and see what we get here. I can change the color lightness with the first slider and the color hue with the second one. This works perfectly. So let's wire up the last slider here to open and close the doors. So I'm going to fetch the animation. I'm going to do this with a Kuesa animation player. I'm going to call this animation player. The scene entity again is C. And the clip we can find out with the asset pipeline editor again. Opening up the car GLTF file, and we have exactly one animation here which is called doors. So if I play this back, this will open the doors. So name is doors, and I'm going to add a clock here. This enables me to set a playback speed. So if I say playback speed, for example, to 1, then this will play the animation with the original speed. But I also can set this to, for example, 0.1 to play it back slower. And I also can set this to -1, for example, to play this backwards. In this example, to close the doors. Okay, the idea is animation clock. And we are going to bind the doors open value to the playback rate here. Playback rate is scene.doors open minus 0.5, because we have a range of 0 to 1 from the slider, but we want to map this to -1 to 1. So we need to multiply this by 2.0 times this. And actually I want to play this back a little faster, so I'm going for 4 here. So then we need to switch on the animation whenever the animation clock playback rate is not 0, because initially the animation player is not on. Let's check out. Oh, there was a... Ah yeah, okay, it's not name, it's clip. Okay, build again. I can open the doors, I can close them, and I also can vary the speed with the slider. Goes slow, fast. Okay, that's it. Okay, the last thing I want to do here is to make it possible to change the viewing angle with the mouse. For this I'm going to create a orbit camera controller. I give it our camera, we already fetched. Node. And I need to set the view center where the camera orbits around. So I want to do this on status changed. So whenever the status equals to 2, which means that the GLTF scene is loaded, we are going to do something. So we are going to change the camera node view center. And there are multiple ways of getting the transformation of a node. For sake of easiness, we are just going to reuse our animation player here. Transform for entity. The node is called, however, the designer specifies in 3ds Max, so let's check out the asset pipeline editor again. Opening up the car GLTF file, and it's called cam.target. Cam.target. And we need the translation. So let's check out. Build, run. Oh, there was a typo. Yeah, perfect. The car is rotating around the specified center. It exactly looks as in 3ds Max and the pipeline editor. And we have some interactivity here. We can change the color of the car and play back the animation. So I hope the video was useful to some of you. Thanks for watching, and bye bye.